Today's guest is Dr. Nicholas Wright, a leading clinical neurologist and neuroscientist. He uses insights from the brain and behaviour at the intersection of emerging technology to analyse competition and conflict in the modern world. Nick is an affiliated scholar at Georgetown University. He's an honorary senior research fellow at UCL. He's a consultant at Intelligent Biology. On artificial intelligence, he advises SAP, Europe's largest tech company. He advised the Pentagon Joint Staff for 10 years, and his latest book is Warhead, How the Brain Shapes War and War Shapes the Brain. The book is fantastic, Warhead, and it's obviously drawing from a diverse skill set. So we just talk a little bit about your background and your training, because you seem to have expertise in different areas.
Or I'm a jack of all trades and master of none, Donald. So you can choose. So
you're a polymath, I guess. Yeah,
oligomath maybe. So I trained as a doctor and worked treating patients with brain problems in Oxford and in London, amongst other things. And then I spent a number of years doing research using functional brain imaging and computational techniques to look at how humans made decisions, and using things like MRI, so functional magnetic resonance imaging. So just like you'd have to image your knee if you hurt your knee, but looking at the brain, and it can look at different brain activity and so on, and using also like looking at magnetic fields in something called MEG and lesioning people temporarily, you'll be pleased to hear, but like stopping bits of their brain working using magnetic fields and so on. I did all of that in London. In a little place called Queen Square, which is a sort of cluster of research institutes in London, and it's where DeepMind, if you know the people who did AlphaGo and so on. So DeepMind was spun out of there. And then I left Britain and I went to the US, and there I worked in Washington, DC, where they asked me to, at one of the big think tanks, they asked me to apply what we're learning about human decision making and apply that to real world decisions, in particular there about nuclear weapons, right? Because actually the centerpiece of nuclear strategy is affecting how other people think, right? That is absolutely the centerpiece of nuclear strategy, and it has been since just after World War II, when nuclear weapons were first thought about strategically. And so I did that, and I got to know the people at the Pentagon there, and I've worked with the people at the Joint Staff in the Pentagon on a wide variety of different projects for over 10 years or so now, and I'm back in the UK, and I still work with different universities and do research. As you know, I've published this book, and I've published other books in the past, more academic books, and I work on cognition, so thinking, on technology, things like AI, and on security, and how all three of those things work together. And so from what you were telling me about your wonderful podcast, that fits sort of very nicely with the types of areas you're interested in.
Yeah, it does. It fits perfectly. It's a really nice mix. So I'm really curious about the brain. I think you make the point the brain is like the primary weapon of war. And what's interesting about the brain is throughout obviously history, technology has changed and we've upgraded technology, but the brain seems to continuously adapt to that. It's very flexible and it can adapt to modern technology as well. So how can we apply these ancient processes, this neural architecture that's very old, and how can that actually fit in a modern environment? Because it's fascinating to me that it does, because obviously we're the only animal that can actually fit into that niche.
Yeah. So I think the thing to remember is that war, by definition, war is politically motivated violence at scale between human groups. That's what war is. It always involves humans. The moment there are absolutely no humans involved, then it's no longer war, right? So even if there were a nuclear war, there would still be humans pressing the metaphorical button on either side, right? Even though that's weapons of awesome power. So humans are always going to be central. Now, as you say, then technologies will change how war operates, but the human side will always be the same. So, for example, you look at World War I, where the defensive weapons, machine guns and barbed wire and so on, they were dominant. And then World War II, where offensive weapons suddenly became more effective. And so rather than having, stalemate for 4 years, you had blitzkrieg, right? You had these lightning attacks using aeroplanes and tanks and so on. But the same basic factors. Do you have the will to fight? Right? The French had the will to fight for 4 years in World War I, suffering incredible losses, the French army, and yet they fought bravely and powerfully and courageously throughout, many, many years of extremely difficult fighting. And then in World War II, the French lost the will to fight, right? And so, yes, the German blitzkrieg was very effective, right, at creating things like surprise and shock and all the rest of it, as hopeful we'll come on to. But the French will to fight collapsed. Right, and so that's why Hitler's cavalry, less than 7 weeks after the start of the German onslaught in May 1940, Hitler's cavalry was clattering up the Champs-Elysees in a victory parade. And you see this will to fight, just as one example, right, which is fundamentally about human brains, right? You choose to fight or run away, right? That is always going to be psychological. And yes, precisely how it will matter, the ways it will matter will change, but it's just as important, for example, in Ukraine. So how did Ukraine repel Russia's initial onslaught in early 2022? They were outnumbered 12-1, the Ukrainians north of Kyiv, 12-1, totally outmatched in terms of tanks and planes and bombs and all the rest of it. And yet they were very brave, and that will to fight enabled them to repel the Russian onslaught. Right, so the will to fight, yes, the costumes change, the weapons change, but the centerpiece is always going to be the human brain. And that's really what's going to determine whether people win or lose.
I think we should definitely talk about models. So obviously this is the central framework of your book, from what I gathered anyway, that the brain obviously creates models of the world. And you mentioned the French there, and I guess the fact that they were really caught off guard by Blitzkrieg. So your brain has something called prediction. It predicts the world, and then you get an error feedback if your prediction doesn't actually match reality. And this is what the Nazis exploited by, I guess, taking the panzer tanks through the Ardennes instead of going through the Belgian border like they did in the First World War. And this obviously caught the French off guard. And I think you could apply it to different examples as well, like throughout history. If you take the Vietnam War and the Tet Offensive, I mean, before that, the American public were being assured they were about to win. And then Tet happened, 80,000 people in one day swarmed into South Vietnam. So this element of surprise is obviously fundamental to ours. So could you talk about that and mention or explain how the brain actually models the world as well, and why that's so fundamental?
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, the idea of a model is absolutely essential to how the brain works, how modern neuroscience, understands that all brains work. And you don't need a really sophisticated brain like yours, Donald. You could be in fact, you don't even need a brain. You could be a single-celled organism. Right? Like an amoeba, the type of thing you might have seen when you were looking through a microscope when you were at school, So a model is a process that links senses, information from senses coming in, to actions that help you achieve your goals, right? And so a single-celled organism, a little amoeba, for example, the type of thing you used to see looking through your microscope, that might see a little bit of food coming in, right? It might detect the food through sort of, chemical trails and so on. And then it can move towards that food to eat the food and achieve its goal of getting nutrition and surviving and reproducing and so on, right? Now, obviously, humans have far more sophisticated models. And in fact, we have a whole orchestra of different models in our brain that help us do an enormous number of different things. But the basics are still the same. We receive our models are processes that help link senses, in stuff coming in, to actions, right? Things we can do that help us achieve our goals. Now, those models are so important because, to give you an example, and just to say these are really, really in there, right? These models aren't metaphors, they're really in there. So to give you an example, you right now and every listener or viewer out there, you have a model of the terrain around you, right? The physical space around you. And this is something that is modeled. It's, we can read out the map of the space you're in, the model of the physical space around you. Literally, we could read it out from a part of your brain called the hippocampus or entorhinal cortex, hippocampal entorhinal region. And we can read out that map that's literally in there. And if we're recording from that map, say in a mouse or another rodent that's walking around, we can see just by recording from its map in the brain, we can see exactly where the mouse is in the real world to within about 1 or 2 inches, just by reading off the map in its brain. So these models are really in there. We have models for all sorts of things. Now, as you said, the models are so important because we're constantly receiving far too much information than we could ever just process, like some passive television set in the brain. So what our models do is they're always making predictions. They're always making predictions about what we expect to see, expect to feel, expect to happen when we make an action and so on. Our models are constantly expecting to see things. And what we really care about is when those models are wrong, when those expectations are wrong, when those expectations are violated, when our predictions about the world are wrong, when there is an error in those predictions, when there is a prediction error. And that's a term that's a really important term in neuroscience, which is prediction error. So it's telling you that your model about the world is wrong in some important way. Now, surprise is one example of prediction error. And so this is one of the reasons why, and it's really fundamental, because surprise tells your brain something about your model is wrong, and you need to update your model. You need to learn. You need to change your model, right? And that's really important. And because of that, essentially every model in our brain uses prediction errors to update it. And that's why everything that happens, right, that is surprising to us can have a really big impact. And that's what happened in France. So on May the 10th, 1940, the Germans attacked, and they used, they were very skillful. They combined the machines of their time, tanks, planes, and so on. And bear in mind, they were attacking. They had, the people defending France, that's the British and the French, we had more trained men, more tanks, more planes, more guns, right? The Germans were outnumbered, but they very skillfully combined the technologies of their time in order to think faster than the Allies and do what was called blitzkrieg. And they pushed through the Ardennes very quickly. And the French troops were surprised. And that surprise was a key factor why their morale collapsed, and they collapsed. Right now, the Germans were very skillful, and that's what enabled them to make the initial inroads. But then French will to fight collapsed, and a big chunk of that was the surprise that the Germans created. And surprise will always be crucial in war. And you see that, for example, now. Why was the Hamas attack on October the 7th impactful on the Israelis, right, in 2023? The reason is that deliberately for 2 or 3 years before, it was a deliberate strategy, and we know this from their documents. Hamas had a deliberate strategy of keeping things calm, right, keeping things predictable, and then suddenly there was a surprise, right, and they attacked in a really flamboyant way, really gruesome, awful things, and that caused a huge psychological impact in the Israelis, that surprise. And so surprise will always be a crucial factor in war. But I'll just say one last thing, and I apologise. I don't want to leave you thinking that this is all negative, because actually you can use surprise for positive things too, right? So Israel and Egypt have been at peace now for over 40 years, right? And what was a key aspect of how that peace was gained? A key thing was Sadat, who was the president of Egypt. Bear in mind, Egypt and Israel had fought two real proper big wars, right? 1967, 1973. But in the late 1970s, Anwar Sadat, he made the very surprising gesture of saying, I will travel to the Knesset, to the Israeli parliament, right, and make a speech. And I will speak to them in their house. And that surprise, right, the novelty of saying that and saying he'd do such a surprising gesture, that really cut through both to Israeli decision makers and also the Israeli public. And it helped break an impasse and helped create peace. So surprise can be used for war, because the human brain is always the central instrument of war, but it can also be used to help generate peace, because the human brain is also the central tool for making peace.
It's interesting that you actually mentioned the positives there. So am I correct in saying that the Biden administration actually exploited or took away the surprise when it controlled the narrative around the Ukraine invasion prior to Putin invading? Because a lot of people actually were dubious that the invasion would happen despite the build-up on the border. And I guess the fact that Ukraine fought so well in the initial stages, and maybe the Russians didn't fight as well as people expected, like it wasn't the Red Army walking in there by any means, that probably encouraged other democracies as well. So it can work in both ways.
Yes, yeah, you're absolutely right. So the first thing the Americans and the British came out very publicly in the run-up to the invasion in February 2022, and they said, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and they said there will be an invasion. Right, as you say, a lot of people said there wouldn't be an invasion, but they said, look, there will be an invasion. It's going to happen, right? So, and that then reduced the surprise amongst a lot of the, members of the public more broadly. And again, exactly as you say, it was actually a positive prediction error. It was a positive surprise. Well, for those of us in the democracies who think it was a good thing that Ukraine did well, that actually the Russians, despite overwhelming superiority in so many ways, actually performed so badly. They had like these just huge traffic jams of, armoured vehicles piling up, for example. Terrible planning, right? A lot of people think, war must be easy to do, right? Well, actually, we in the West have seen the Americans and the British and so on do war very well, very skillfully in places like, the first Gulf War or the invasion of Iraq in 2003, right? We can have a whole discussion about the rights and wrongs of it and what happened afterwards, but the initial invasion was extremely well executed. That is very hard to do. And to be honest with you, the Russians made a pig's breakfast of the planning. And again, that was a lot of very human errors. And that was a big positive prediction error for us in the West, because we, realised that Russia was a lot less good at fighting and was a lot less threatening than we feared it was.
Can I just ask a slightly nerdy question? So the way you wrote about prediction errors and models throughout the book was really fantastic. I've never seen anyone do it so well for a general audience, because it was very comprehensible for someone who maybe doesn't have experience in this. But did you have Friston's free energy principle framework, like active inference in mind and predictive coding? Or were you more thinking about like reinforcement learning and temporal difference learning?
Both. For those of you who do want to get nerdy. So back at Queen Square, so back in my lab, So Carl Friston was on the first functional brain imaging paper I ever published back in about 2009, 2008. I forget exactly when I published it now. So I think he was on there. I said it. He definitely advised. He definitely gave us advice. And he was in the lab and we all imbibed his ideas about things like the free energy principle and so on. But then equally, my second supervisor was Peter Diane, right, who was one of the key people on the 1997 paper that is taken as is the sort of key paper for thinking about prediction errors, right, which is Reed Montague, Peter Dan and Wolfram Schultz on reinforcement learning and dopaminergic neurons and so on. So both of those things were part of it, but I think it's a broader principle. And I would just say also, with respect to Carl Friston's sort of framework, I think you can actually separate out prediction errors and the free energy principle. So the free energy principle, as I understand it, and it's difficult to understand. Let's not pretend.
Big time, yeah.
But fun.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. It's fascinating, but it's somewhat inscrutable.
As I said in my leaving speech at Queen Square, I said, it's a bit like, I think Churchill described Russia as like an enigma, sphinx wrapped in an enigma in a riddle, or words to that effect. And I was like, and that's very much how I've always thought of Carl's description of the free energy principle. But I think you can separate the free energy principle, which I think is in many ways a theory of life, right, and how life works, a mathematical structure for thinking about how life works, and you can separate that from how he believes and others believe human brains actually do the process of minimizing free energy, right? And so I think the two are separate, and you could agree with one and not the other, right? Or you could agree with both, or you could agree with neither. So I would just say, I think that's a really important point. And like things like prediction error, I would say are really at this stage a just general idea that are important across many, many different frameworks and many different timescales on which the human brain works. And, and I don't think we need to anymore think about it as tied really too strongly to either the original work with dopaminergic neurons or Carl's framework.
I've even seen people theorize that like general intelligence model from classical psychology is all about prediction, and maybe the higher G you have, the less surprise you get about unpredictable situations. So can we just close the loop there? Because you mentioned dopaminergic neurons. So most of the public kind of think about the brain working with dopamine and serotonin and all these things, and noradrenaline. Maybe we'll mention something from the book here. So there was a really fantastic, vivid scene of an Aztec warrior fighting for his life, and his brainstem was helping him, and the brainstem was throwing up these neurochemicals. So how do they connect to the idea of modeling?
Let's just take, for example, dopaminergic neurons. So the brainstem is a bit of the brain right down at the base of the brain, and it sends projections up that broadcast, across pretty much the whole of the brain, right, and have really widespread effects. And so we can think about three different neurotransmitters, three different groups of cells that send up three different chemicals throughout the many, many parts of the brain. So first of all, let's think about dopamine. So dopamine, like everything else, dopamine does many things, but one of the things dopamine does is that it signals a reward, right? So you have these little brain cells down in the base of the brain that send projections up throughout the brain, and those things fire if you have a monkey and you give the monkey, and you're recording from those little neurons, right? And you give the monkey a tasty bit of juice, or a grape, right? We'll say a grape because it's more fun. And you give the monkey a little grape, and it's like, oh, lovely, and the neurons go, oh, delicious, right? But then when you immediately before you give the monkey a grape, a little bit before you give the monkey a grape, you show a picture of I don't know, whatever it is, a picture of a spoon or a red triangle or whatever. In the end, it realizes that every time it sees the picture of the red triangle, it will then get a grape a little bit in the future. So what happens then is that the dopamine neurons then encode the surprising event of seeing the red triangle. They no longer really encode when it receives the grape, it's encoding the surprising predictive event of seeing the red triangle. Now, what if you show the monkey a red triangle and then you don't give the monkey a grape, right? So then you've got a surprise, but it's a negative surprise, right? So, and what happens then is that those dopaminergic neurons, they actually start, because they're firing all the time, and instead of like showing a little, like continuing to fire, they actually have a pause where it was expecting the grape. So it's signaling a negative prediction error. So I could go on, but the gist is, and there's loads of work now where they've shown it causally, and it's very important to show that we've then also looked at humans, and we've shown the same pattern in humans using functional brain imaging and so on, and recordings. And we've also, in animals, you can do a causal experiment. So you turn these neurons on and off, and you do all sorts of clever experiments. And you can show causally that these neurons record prediction errors, right? Predictions and prediction errors and expectations. So that's an example from dopaminergic neurons and how they specifically show the patterns that are predicted by this prediction error idea. The idea that we have models of the world, and when something's surprising and so on, or predictable, and then when things are wrong, there's a prediction error, then that's what these neurons are recording.
That's absolutely fascinating to think about. So if we move higher up the brain, like mammals have things like grid cells in their brain where they can actually track space. And this is amazing to think about. But what I find interesting about the human capacity to track space is this is flexible enough to extend to people who are in naval ships and navigating in naval battles. Like, it just seems surprising to me that obviously brain structures that have evolved for being on land can actually be applied to seafaring, even though we're not naturally seafaring creatures. How does that work?
Well,
That's
you're
amazing.
I mean, because it is amazing. And so, for example, as humans, we could live in a jungle, right, in which we will only be able to see very small distance in front of us, or we could live out on the savannah, or we could go up a hill, and and we can piece together different maps, different places we've been to, stitch those maps together in our minds and work out how to get from A to B, even if we've never followed a particular path in the real world, just because we've stitching together different maps from our experiences or things that we've seen from the top of the mountain or whatever. And in the same way, we can have maps of the seas, of the oceans. And in addition to that, one of the great things about maps, and as I said, these maps are really in there, right? We can read out where an animal is just by reading out its map. And what's really cool as well, and there are some videos of that you can see on YouTube and so on, when you have a rodent, for example, going in a maze, and the rodent's just sitting there, right? And then it's imagining going left or going right, at a turn in the maze, and you can watch it sweeping through the map, right? You can just on the recording of its brain, right? Absolutely amazing stuff. So, and there's you can replay things and pre-play, and there's all sorts of clever stuff to do with how we stitch all these different maps together. Now, absolutely right, we can then do that with land, but we can also do that on the oceans, right? And say, for example, you have someone like Admiral Lord Nelson or someone in World War II or now, right, who has to think, you might think about a whole ocean. So one of the things our maps can do is they can work at the scale. So your map now, Donal, it could be thinking about the whole of the world. Then it can zoom into Ireland, and then it can zoom into, I don't know exactly where you are, but your locality. And then it can be within your house, and then it could be your office, right? Your map can work at all of these different scales. And it's the same thing. So Admiral Lord Nelson, for example, who was a famous admiral in the Age of Sail, he was involved in a huge cat and mouse game, right? This is just before the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. A huge cat and mouse game across the whole of and this was in the Age of Sail, right? across the whole of the Atlantic with the French. All they needed was 24 hours to cross the channel to invade England. And they were trying to lure him away and do all of this stuff. And a huge cat and mouse game, no spotter planes, no GPS. He was navigating using, maps in his brain, essentially, at the scale of whole oceans. But then equally, he could work at the scale of just a small bit of coastline, right? And for someone as skilled as he, with understanding how tides and winds and sailing boats could work, he, for example, in the Battle of the Nile, his ships were able to get behind. The French were moored near the entrance to the Nile, and they were moored in a way that they thought was utterly impregnable near the coast, right, in a line. And Nelson's ships managed to get. The French didn't think it was possible. They managed to get, just through brilliant seamanship, get behind the French, and then basically destroy and win this famous battle and destroy the French fleet. And Napoleon got stuck in Egypt, and that's why the Rosetta Stone is in London and not in Paris, and all the rest of it. But again, it was because our brains can operate on these maps at very different scales, and we can also look at completely abstract maps like cyberspace, right? So I work with cyber warriors who work at places like the NSA, National Security Agency, and so on, and they're able to chase people through cyberspace. Right, literally. And the same with space warriors. It sounds ridiculous to say space warriors, but there really are. There is Space Command. There are space warriors, right? And the Russians as well. The Russians are using all sorts of space maneuvers on European satellites. It was discussed recently, right? And there are space warriors who are able to think in 3 dimensions, right, in the space surrounding the Earth. And in the future, we'll probably have some kind of space war involving the moon and supply lines to the moon. And we'll be talking about some future Nelson and how that future Nelson did some clever things involving, chasing to and fro on the way to the moon.
Absolutely incredible. So you mentioned the scale there of how our maps can actually adapt to different scales. This has to obviously connect to fear of national boundaries. So if you look at China, I guess, is a good example, because China has like 14 national boundaries and it's very concerned about territorial claims in the Pacific. And you could say the same thing with Russia, which maybe an aspect of Russia's motivation to actually take Ukraine is to have a land barrier between it and NATO or the European Union. So how does this play out on a larger scale when we think about like national boundaries? Because obviously countries and leaders are aware of this and they are nervous if they can't control their boundaries.
Yeah. So I think the first thing to say is it's not simply, so we humans will always care about, my territory, my resources, because if you don't have the resources to bring up your young to survive, then you won't, be able to bring up your young, and you won't survive. And it's as simple as that. So we will always care. Most humans will care deeply about food, water, resources, and our ability to get to those resources, however, whatever it is, the territory that's required to get those resources. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, though, that there's just like a boundary of my territory versus your territory, right? I think with humans, it's much more permeable than that. And so let's look at our closest ape, like cousins, right? So gorillas, for example, can have a central part of their territory, which is like that's the core. But then actually, other guerrilla troops can come in and out, and there are areas that are much more, they're happy for the other guerrillas to go in and out of these shared parts of territory, for example. So, but that doesn't mean that, if push comes to shove, guerrillas won't fight. If there are resource constraints, they need those resources. And I think it's the same thing with humans. Obviously, we are much more sophisticated in the way that we think about these things, but that type of broad understanding of territory will always matter. And if you look at, for example, about World War II, just the last war we had, what was that fought over? That was fought fundamentally, for example, Hitler literally, he wrote it in a book, he wanted Lebensraum, he wanted living space, right? World War I had been fought in part over Alsace-Lorraine. Territory will always be part of these things. It's a bit more, now, other things like where, for example, is the boundary on the sea? So a lot of today's discussions in the South China Sea, for example, rest on how do you define where somebody's territory is on the sea? If we think about cyberspace, where are the boundaries in cyberspace? How do you think about if the Russians have infected a computer server in the Netherlands, are the British and the Americans able to go in and do something directly in there? Or is that actually a Dutch server, even though actually the Russians are controlling it, right? So we have to think about all of these things. It's more sophisticated than just this is my bit and that's your bit. But nevertheless, sovereignty will always matter. And if you think now, for example, about Donald Trump, and you think about Greenland, a lot of people think, oh, ludicrous. The stuff about Greenland is just stupid. Both yes and no. So actually, the Americans are, they are correct that the Arctic is very vulnerable, and that a lot of countries were letting the Chinese and so on set up giant listening posts in the Arctic, and it was all a bit, and the Russians really are building lots of military capabilities there, and all the rest of it, right? It's not nonsense, and we need to beef the whole thing up and secure it. Now the question then becomes, should the Americans be doing that? Now Greenland is utterly the people of Greenland cannot defend Greenland. It's ludicrous to think 50,000 odd people, they're not going to be able to defend themselves. The Danes are also utterly incapable of defending Greenland, right? So there are just a few million Danes, right, and they're very far away. Should the Americans have, they're the people who ultimately are going to protect Greenland from the Russians and the Chinese. Now, at the moment, Greenland is, to all intents and purposes, part of an informal empire that the United States has, right? But what's to stop, if sovereignty does matter, and what's to stop the people of Greenland saying, we are independent, we don't want the Americans or the Danes? And so then there comes a whole set of discussions about, can and should, given that Greenland cannot defend itself, and ultimately it will be the Americans who are defending them, certainly against Russians and Chinese, how, who should have what? How should it be controlled? And these are very live questions, and it isn't anywhere near as simple as a lot of the debates in Europe make it out to be.
I want to come in on that because I actually very much agree with you. So in Ireland, we're a neutral country, but we're a neutral country without a defence capacity. And if anything ever did happen and we had to defend ourselves, we'd be relying on Britain and America. So I think a lot of the talk of neutrality and anti-American imperialism or whatever is just virtue signaling and mostly nonsense. But I think possibly in the West, so I visited China last summer and the summer before, and they seem to embrace war a bit more. So a lot of the movies are about war and nationalism. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing, but in the West, I think we seem to be a bit detached. The idea of war seems a bit abstract. And I don't think that's a good thing, because if it does come, because obviously the world is becoming a little bit more unstable over maybe the last decade, I don't know if the West is ready for that. I'm not sure what you think of that.
I mean, you've read my book, so you know that I agree with you. So no, I mean, I think that had you asked me 10 years ago, certainly had you asked me in 2013, what are the chances of there being World War III, a war, across, in East Asia and in Europe and in the Middle East? I'd have said, vanishingly small. Yes, there was the possibility of a war between America and China over Taiwan, for example, but the chance of that were very slim, because it would be about misunderstandings on both sides. It'd be a bit like the run-up to World War I, right? Neither country wanted to go to war, but misunderstandings on both sides, and they were both a bit too belligerent and militaristic, and it could, spiral and escalate it and get to war, even though neither intended for that to be the case. But I think that is no longer the world we live in. So for 25 years after the end of the Cold War, the US had overwhelming military superiority, and that is just simply no longer the case. The Chinese have, very serious military capabilities now, and that's backed up by the fact they are the world's only manufacturing superpower. So China now produces as much stuff as the next 4 or maybe even 9 countries in the world combined. They dominate things like drone manufacturing, electric vehicle manufacturing, and so on. And I think in terms of capabilities, they could win a long war over somewhere like Taiwan against the United States and its allies. So then it comes down to the question of intentions, right? And again, this is about the human brain, right? This is about human brains. And in this case, it's specifically about the human brain of Xi Jinping, right? Xi Jinping is the paramount leader of China. He is the most powerful leader of China since Mao Zedong died back in the mid-1970s. Xi came to power in 2012, essentially, and he has changed China to become more authoritarian internally and more assertive in terms of foreign policy. And he has set, for example, his military a target. This is well established. This isn't a contentious statement. He said his military a target of being, this doesn't mean he will do it, but of being able to take Taiwan by 2027. Right, so that's by next year. And to that end, they have been building ever more remarkable capabilities, amphibious assault capabilities and so on, to take Taiwan, which is a small island about 100 miles off the coast of mainland China. And he could choose to press the metaphorical button and order an invasion of Taiwan. So they now have the capabilities, and he may well have the intention of doing that. And that's about his brain, the brain of somebody who doesn't really just, doesn't necessarily think about the world in the same way that we do.
That's a very good point. There's a lot there that you said that I'll try and get you. But so you mentioned qi. So one very interesting analysis in your book, so it's actually about memory and how memory is almost like a assimilation engine for the future, and it can guide narratives. And obviously it can, we know that, because of the effectiveness of propaganda and nationalism in terms of national narratives. But if we compare Xi's narrative about China to Mao, it's changed a little bit. So it's not just about the socialist experiment and the role of the Cultural Revolution. It's more about China in the world and I guess Chinese nationalism, especially on foreign policy. So I think another person, actually Kevin Rudd, who's the former Australian Prime Minister, he said that Xi is moved more, I guess, more so than Deng Xiaoping in terms of Marxist-Leninist principles, I guess, domestically, but on foreign policy, he's more right-wing or nationalist. So could you talk about how the narrative is changing there and how, I guess, collective memory can be used to shape that?
Yeah. So I think that you're absolutely right. So I'll just talk in general about memory. So what's memory for? Memory is for the future, right? We have memories not to have some veridical, perfect, explanation of what happened in the past, but we have memories to help us navigate the future, right? It helps us. So we have a treasure trove of different memories, and we can use those to simulate potential futures and then choose which futures we might want to have. Right, so that's what memories are for, and without memories we are lost. So I remember there's a chap I write about in the book, who's someone I treated in the University of Oxford at the teaching hospital there, and I was one of the doctors looking after him. And every morning I would meet this chap. He could speak perfectly well, and he was, whatever, tall, strapping chap with a sort of more military style moustache in his sort of early to mid 60s. But every day I would have the same conversation because he had a particular part of his brain that is important for encoding new memories had become inflamed, and he just couldn't encode new memories. And so every day he would just meet me afresh. And so he was just unable to navigate the world, the world around him, because he had no memory of what was going on, who people were, and what was happening. So our memory is really important for navigating the future. And as groups, right, one of the remarkable things about humans, right, we are the only primates that can form groups of more than a few hundred individuals. No other primates can, right? You might get a few hundred baboons, right? But humans can create tribes, and then we can have thousands of individuals, and we can create states of, millions, thousands, millions, 1.4 billion in the case of China. Right. So how do we do that? So the way we can get to this next stage is by creating shared understandings of the world. Right. It's a culture, rules about how things work around here. And that requires us to have shared memories and understandings also about who we are, our identities. Right. Our identities about who we are as individuals, and then our culture of the group of which we're a part. And a lot of that boils down to the memories of who we are and what we are and who's on our team and who's not on our team and so on. Now, thinking about how China's memories, collective memories, which are anchored in our own personal memories, thinking about how those have changed, you're absolutely right. So Mao Zedong, so China was in a civil war essentially from not long after, it was in turmoil in the civil war essentially from when the last empire ended Qing Empire ended in 1912 through to 1949 when the Chinese took over, right? The Chinese Communist Party took over and it became the People's Republic of China, everywhere except Taiwan, right? Where the nationalists remained. Now, for Mao Zedong, who was the leader of the communists during a lot of that, and then for the first, 2.5 decades of Chinese rule, of the People's Republic of China, the story, his way of understanding the world was one of, exactly as you said, it was communist, it was Marxist. So it was about class struggle. it was the rise of the proletariat. Now, for him, it wasn't so much about China; it was about the rise of the proletariat. And for that reason, the Chinese nationalist troops, right, under the chap called Chiang Kai-shek, who did most of the fighting against the communists, did do some fighting in World War II, right, the Chinese communists, but most of the hard fighting against the Japanese was done by the nationalists. They were sort of written out of China's World War II story, except as the bad guys. So, but what Xi Jinping has done is he's changed the story from one of a Marxist story of the rise of the proletariat, as the story was told under Mao, to one of China's victorious war against Japan, right, in which co-opts, which brings in, that changes the memory, it brings in the nationalists who fought very bravely for a long period of time. They fought for 8 years in World War II, the nationalists, and were never beaten by the Japanese, despite horrific battles and losses. Quite a remarkable story. So I focus on that in part of the book. But those nationalists, so he takes those nationalist troops, those nationalist victories, right, and certainly the nationalist soldiers' courage and resolve and resilience, and he takes that, Xi Jinping, and he blends that into the story of China now. And so the story is less one about the rise of the proletariat, and it becomes one more about how China helped win World War II, and therefore how China should be one of the key countries that sets up the world and sets the rules for the world.
It's scary actually to be in the West, because I think some people are still a bit inoculated or not aware of the power of China. Let's just talk about AI. So obviously there is something of an arms race. You could call it, like, you could, I guess, analogize it to the Cold War in terms of AI between the US and China. It looks like the US is winning at the moment, but I think China's probably ahead in terms of robotics. So how might AI play out if there is a war between, and like hopefully there isn't, but if China does invade Taiwan and America does intervene, perhaps it won't, but maybe if it does intervene, how would AI factor in there? And would it play a role in terms of decision making? Would it play a role in terms of strategy, like, I guess, AlphaGo, Move 37, that kind of thing? As it stands right now, what are we thinking in terms of AI and human hybrid warfare?
Okay, so I think so the first thing to say is, if there's a war between America and China, there'll be what happens initially, and then there could be what happens if that becomes a prolonged war. So it's important to remember that wars between fully great powers, right, and both China and America are fully great powers, they often go on for years, right? The Napoleonic Revolutionary Wars went on for 25 years, essentially, right? That's from 1789, French Revolution, to 1815, Battle of Waterloo, right? The World War I went on for 4 years. World War II for China went on for 8 years, for Britain went on for 6 years. The great power wars go on for a really long time. And so I think we need to think about how that would affect things. So yes, so the first thing to say is that AI is already being used for visual perception, right, or an auditory perception, and analysing data coming in. So it's used more for perception, for looking at things, images or from captured from space or from drones or whatever. So AI is already used for that. It will be increasingly used for decision making and coming up with logistics, for example. So the Chinese are already, they're using AI logistics, certainly in the civilian sector, but that's going to become increasingly part of the thing. And so everything is going to start, all the parts of the military enterprise, from sensing things through to making decisions and plans in headquarters, through to taking actions. They will increase through things like robots, robotized forces. They are going to increasingly use AI. Now, where, for example, how does the brain fit in, and how will humans work with this, right? So just at the end of last summer, there was the announcement of the first time that lethal force was delivered by a swarm of drones, right? AI-powered drones, a swarm. So it was in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians had a little group of drones, and those drones, a human commander targeted chose a target, and then that little group of drones could then it decided how it was going to, that little group of drones, that swarm of drones was going to deliver lethal force to destroy that target, to kill people, right? First time that had been announced in history, publicly. Now, that's Ukraine versus Russia. That is nothing compared to what technological powers like the US and China would be doing, even in the early parts of a war, let alone, imagine 2 or 3 years in the war where both sides are absolutely ramping up their production and research and all the rest of it. So I think what we're going to have is, for example, is swarms of drones, and they will be dueling with each other. So think about the Battle of Britain, right? What was the Battle of Britain? The Battle of Britain was a battle of relatively, and it was absolutely crucial for world history, right? And it was a battle where you had, I think there were about 2,500 RAF pilots versus a few more German pilots, right? We're talking hundreds of people engaged, hundreds of actual pilots, dueling technologists in the cutting edge technology of their day, dueling, right, for supremacy over the skies of Britain in the Battle of Britain, Nazi Germany versus, Britain. Now, I think we're going to have something very similar, but we're going to have the battle of dueling technologists where they will be controlling swarms of drones, right? You have humans controlling swarms of drones. Now, how will they be doing that? So the idea that a human is going to be what's called in the loop and will be sitting there, and every decision a swarm of drones makes, a human will be saying, yeah, that's great. Yeah, do that, right? It's not feasible because you won't win, basically. So I think what you're going to have is you're going to have humans at what's called on the loop. You can have a human talking to a swarm of drones, and giving the drones that human's intentions about what it wants the drones to do. And then that swarm of drones is going to be giving its feedback to the human. So the human and the drones are going to be communicating with each other. And that communication will rely just as much on understanding the human as it does on understanding the swarm of drones, right? And that making that unit of the human and the swarm of drones effective as a human pilot in a Spitfire or a human pilot in a Messerschmitt Me-109, right? That will be just as important as the technology. A lot of the technology that's used in the drones, it will be how the humans and the drones can be used together, can communicate with each other to create military effectiveness. And so that's one example of how we're going to be using these new technologies and how the human side of it is going to be so central.
Wow, yeah, it's a scary thought, but it's futuristic. It's incredible to think about. But so, as quick as AI is and as flexible as, say, like a transformer system or the modern AI models are, they're not as agile as like the human neocortex. They're not malleable between tasks as well. They don't have that robustness. Yeah. So even in this situation, like the drones aren't going to be autonomous. Like they don't have that, I guess you could say, metacognition. Like you mentioned things in your book about how you might have two neural networks and one neural network examines the other neural network to try and give it feedback. But it's still, you're putting technology on top of technology. They just don't have that robustness and efficiency of the human brain. So do you ever see a stage where it does get to that level of autonomy or agency, if you want to use that word?
So I basically you're saying, are we going to get to artificial general intelligence?
I guess I'm thinking in terms of actually deploying it more. So there doesn't seem to be, like AGI doesn't really seem to be a thing that is playing out the way people expected maybe 2 years ago. It just seems to be these like more incremental improvements. Yeah. But it just doesn't seem like the incremental improvements are going to just add up magically to complete agency. That's not the way it's looking right now.
No, and I mean, I agree with you. I think so. The way a human brain works, and so for example, this is something that Demis Hassabis, so the people who won the AI Nobel Prizes a couple of years back in 2024. So it was Demis Hassabis. So he was a card-carrying neuroscientist who did his research on memory and imagination right at Queen Square at the lab. And we shared an office for a short period of time. We had a desk in the same office as he was leaving after his PhD, and I was starting mine. And Geoffrey Hinton, who was just next door at Queen Square. And now they're card-carrying neuroscientists. They will understand all of this. So exactly, it's not just the human brain is not one single system that is really great. It is many, many different systems that all work together, right? That are integrated together. So, for example, to give you an example of integration, so we have systems for language, right? Right now, Donal, you're listening to me and you're hearing, you have systems that are getting input from your auditory cortex into your language systems. But equally, your language systems can get input if you read what I was saying as a transcript, right? You'd actually be using the same language systems, but they would be linked to a different part of the brain, the visual cortex, that could be giving you, and occipital cortex, that can be giving you the visual information, the words, right? But then it goes up to the same area. So we have different systems that integrate together in different ways to do different things. Now, right now, so the big leap we made in 2012, the reason why AI got very fashionable was basically visual perception. So that there was a big leap. There was a thing called ImageNet, and it was a competition for visual object recognition. Is this a picture of a spoon? Is this a picture of a monkey? Is this a picture of whatever? Right. And what wowed everybody was suddenly you got a computer program, an AI, that was reaching almost human levels of capability to identify objects. But that was just visual object recognition. So then people got very excited, 2022, when it was now able to do language, right? And you could be the richest person in the world 10 years ago, and you would not have the language capabilities of my phone, So we then added on language, right? But the thing is, then people got excited maybe a couple of years ago about planning, right? So planning was the next big thing. Oh, we can plan. Right, so it could, the 4.0 and all the rest of it, ChatGPT was able to plan its answers to you, right, and give you a whole step-by-step part of your answer. And agents can now plan things. And now all of those different things I've talked about: visual perception, language, planning, right? Those are all things we have different brain systems for, and we integrate those together. And then you talked about metacognition, or our ability to think about our own thinking, make models of ourselves. And that's then, right, the bit just behind the forehead, the frontal pole, that's the most uniquely human part of the brain. And so, yeah, we can think about our own thinking. We have a whole bit of the brain that is really important for thinking about our own thinking, interrogating our own models of the world. So our brain is like an orchestra. It has all those different bits. The dopamine things we talked about right at the beginning. Emotions like fear, right? Well, you need fear, anger, and so on. Actions, the ability to make actions, the ability to do all of these different things. And our whole brain works like an orchestra. It requires the whole orchestra, all the way from the brainstem through to the frontal pole that does our most sophisticated thinking about thinking. And without the whole of the orchestra, right, you're not going to get a Beethoven symphony, right? You're going to get something that is, doesn't sound like a Beethoven symphony. And that's, I think, what's going to be needed for AI. We're going to have to basically develop many, many different systems. And then also, in addition to that, work out how to integrate those specialized systems together to create the orchestra, with which you live the symphony of your life, and that I live the symphony of my life. Right. Now, will we do that? I think we probably will. When will we do that? I don't know.
Jan LeCun talks about these world models. Is he talking about what you were talking about, do you think, in terms of you need to be able to have embodiment and take in things from the environment? Or is he talking more about metacognition, where you can kind of model your own thinking, and then you kind of say, I think you mentioned in the book that you can think about your thinking, so you can
It was actually my daughter, who was 11 at the time, who we went to the inaugural lecture of a friend of mine, who's her godfather, who works on metacognition, and she was like, Daddy, if you can think about thinking, can you think about your thinking about your thinking? I was like, oh, that's very good, Cece. But yeah, so no, I would say on the whole, when people talk about world models, so like the NVIDIA chap, Jensen Huang, really, usually what they're talking about there is robots and the physical world. And so what you have is these, for example, visual language action models, right? So you have a model that can do visual, it can work out, it can perceive. It can also do language, so it can get concepts like face, monkey, spoon, whatever. can perceive faces, monkeys, and spoons. It can have concepts that essentially, let's not get into the details of what is a concept and stuff, but essentially concepts of face, monkey, spoon. And then it can make actions, caress a face, pick up a spoon, tickle a monkey, right? So when you have all of those things together, they reinforce each other. So, for example, I have a model of the world. I'm perceiving the world using my eyes, and I'm walking around in it. And if I stub my toe, I get feedback that my model of the world is wrong, right? So these models can all reinforce each other, right? They can keep us grounded to reality because they're all linked together, and they sort of that they reinforce one another. Now, I think that's much more the thing. But that said, the metacognition part of it will be really important, because what metacognition will enable us to do is, and what it does enable us to do, is it's like an extra independent bit at the top. So it's like a conductor of the orchestra. It can say, stop everybody. You think you've seen a monkey over there in the cafe in like suburban Dublin. Have you really seen a monkey? How likely is that? And then it tells us to, stop and think and reflect and then decide. Give us what's our uncertainty on that, visual perception that we have a monkey in this cafe in suburban Dublin or not, and so that's what our metacognition can do, and so that's useful. But it's just one extra. I mean, I know the word module is probably deeply unfashionable, but I think essentially what you've got is you're going to end up with an AI brain composed of many, many different specialized modules, and they will all be needed to be integrated together. And one key part of that is the embodied world model part of it.
So that's like the kind of classical evolutionary views of intelligence would have thought, which is we're meant to move away from, but maybe we need them. So sorry, were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I think the thing is that like I'm speaking to you, Donal, and I'm pretty confident, unless you are computer generated, you're a proper general intelligence. If I created an artificial brain with your brain's capabilities, I'd be the most famous scientist in the world, right? So we know, it's like, why did everyone get excited in 2012 with ImageNet? Because we got to human levels, or almost at that point, human levels of visual object recognition, right? Why did we get excited my mind was exploded by, generative AI, ChatGPT, right? It was incredible. Because suddenly we got to human levels of language. And so you, Donal, are a remarkable general intelligence, and like why we are going to benchmark in my opinion, artificial intelligence in like when we're thinking about the orchestra of things against a general intelligence like you or any listener out there, just as we do the same for vision or language or folding laundry is the classic thing. Everyone says, robots at the moment, the best robots in the world are less good at folding a basket of laundry than you are, which is apparently still true. I hope it's still true at the time of this goes out.
I think it is.
So human performance is still, where that's still the benchmark. And I think it will be for general intelligence as much as it is for all those other things.
Fascinating. You mentioned a lot of things in the book about human enhancement. So it kind of reminded me of the whole cyberneticist idea about having like a human machine soldier. So you mentioned things like drugs, like a type of methamphetamine was used by Nazi soldiers during the Second World War, and then you have modafinil and you have various things. So in terms of like special operations, like what the US did with Madura, is that what we're looking at? Are we still looking at like humans performing those type of operations, maybe enhanced with either like perhaps genetic enhancements, drugs, or sensors and things like that? So is it going to be human hybrid technological warfare for those type of special operations?
I mean, I think the first thing to say about this is that a lot of those types of technologies just don't actually work very well at the moment, right? So, for example, I would not want anybody to implant something in my brain unless I really needed it, right? Because given the current technologies we have, you get scarring around the electrodes, gliosis, and all this stuff. It doesn't work that well right now. Now, if we get in a prolonged war, just as, for example, we started World War II without nuclear weapons and without jet engines, and we ended World War II with nuclear weapons and with jet engines and rockets, the V2 rockets, that could go from Peenemünde to London, So a lot of stuff will get invented. But now, what will happen in terms of these different soldiers? To some extent, like to predict the future, I don't know which of the technologies work very well, but I think we will do all of those things. I think we will probably get to direct brain-computer interfaces that will be able to control. So the humans that I described who will be controlling swarms of drones will probably be doing it through direct brain-computer interfaces, right?
Wow.
And so on. I think that kind of thing probably will happen. The other thing to remember is that ethics always changes in war, right? So before World War II, the British really strongly believed that they should not be bombing German cities. They should be bombing only with leaflets. And the way to change the German mind was to bomb with leaflets, to persuade the Germans that what they were doing was bad, right? Fine, we all think it's ludicrous now, clear, well, not all of us, but lots of people think that's ludicrous now because they were it was Nazi Germany. But that was what people generally believed. But clearly, the ethical decisions changed, right? And that will always happen in war. So the Germans then probably accidentally bombed London. But then the British were you've bombed London, right? Well, we're now going to bomb one of your cities. And then it got tit for tat, and basically the Germans did Coventry, right? Smashed Coventry, which is a city in England, to pieces. And so the British said, right, you bomb Coventry, we're going to Coventryise your cities, right? And so we then smashed their cities to pieces. So
firebombing of Dresden and later
and so on. And the thing is that the other thing is that was actually effective. So not Dresden necessarily, but like strategic bombing of Germany was effective, both diplomatically with the Russians, but also just in terms of the fact that it was the only way we could strike back, and it did draw an enormous number of German fighter planes to defend the German homeland, which then really helped the Russians and enabled things like, for example, the Russian victory in Stalingrad. So it was genuinely important. It's this whole idea that it had no military utility. Not true. Ethics will change, and what we now absolutely would not do, we will do in war, right? Especially a prolonged war. And so your question of where will we be going? I think, we will be. The British and others used amphetamines in World War II. We will not as extensively as the Germans, but we will be using performance-enhancing drugs. We will be using brain-computer interfaces. We'll be doing all of these things. If we get into a prolonged great power conflict, you want to win. It doesn't mean anything goes, and it's why we need to think so carefully about the ethics beforehand. But pretending we're not going to do these things, again, that's not a tenable thing either. We need to think through how we should be planning for these potential futures that we can see. And just to say, I will not end on a note of optimism. I'm optimistic. I think hopefully if we understand ourselves better as humans, we can avoid war, right? And I think hopefully as democracies, if we understand ourselves better as humans, we can, if we have to fight a war, we will win a war, right? So I'm optimistic, but that means
I agree with you 100%. And that was a really, really good point about how ethics changes in wars. So it was an absolute pleasure, Nick. Thank you. Absolute pleasure. And again, congratulations on the book. It was absolutely fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed reading every single bit of it, and I'd recommend it to anybody. It was fantastic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Donal.